Hello and welcome to a very brief description, enough to hopefully whet your appetite, of CSLA and a sample application to go with it that's basic at all levels to help understand the architecture and the use of CSLA and understand what we mean by a pluggable data access layer and the benefits of having it. So let's dive right in. And before we start looking at code and things like that, what I like to get people to do is think about the global view of what we're doing. You have to do that today. And so what we're doing is we're assuming this is our back-end architecture, where we've got a client computer running a Windows Forms UI, or it could be any UI, a presentation layer. And they're connected to the internet, which goes to some firewall at our enterprise building or server farm. And then you've got some application servers that connect to, on the same network, a database server. Alright. Now for this instance that we're going to cover today, we're going to cover one particular object, a person object. We'll look at the database schema. This video is going to morph into many videos that will come out over the coming months that go over intricate details of CSLA, because CSLA is a very good way to force you to adhere to some kind of standards, or at least get you thinking in a way that will help others around you maintain your code and extend your code for many years should you move on or should you get assigned to another project. So first, where does CSLA come from? Well, CSLA is from Rockford Loka. It came back over 10 years ago, so it's a very mature and continually evolving framework. I recommend you check him out, loka.net, his ebook series. I get every book he writes, and I would recommend you do the same. He's also a teacher. He teaches at the Visual Studio Live events, VS Live. Most of the time he goes to the one in Orlando and the one in Vegas. I've personally been to the one in Vegas. Make sure you pony up a little bit of extra money and go to his workshops. Worth every penny. That's mostly where I first started with CSLA. He was teaching some workshops and I went to him. Then I went to some more workshops, and to this day I try to go every chance I get. So check him out online here. I'm going to pull that off, get back to our architecture. And here's what we're looking at. We're looking at the firewalls we discussed, the client. We've got a Windows Forms UI laying on top of this library.net, which is actually smart objects. They're CSLA objects. We've got one that's called the person. We'll look at it. But understand that anytime that object wants to get, set, update, delete any kind of data, that it actually has to clone itself over the network to the application machine, run itself, and then come back. Now in order to do that, it obviously has to be serializable. Now in order to clone a complete object, there's only two in the .NET framework that can do it. The binary formatter and the net data contract serializer. Now, by default, we use the binary formatter. If you are sure that you're only going to have .NET applications, then use the net data contract serializer. Problem with that is you're going to have to mark, if you're using WCF, data members, data contracts, all that stuff, instead of just making the class serializable. So I highly recommend, if you can, use a binary formatter. Now, for people who are advanced .NET, they're going to say, wait a minute, Dean, time out. In Silverlight and in Windows Phone applications, we don't have these two serializers. You are correct. But CSLA does provide something called the mobile formatter. It's part of the framework that you can use, and it functions virtually identical to the two I mentioned earlier. That's advanced. Keep checking down the videos, and we'll go over them. Now, the video series is going to follow his books, his CSLA 4 ebooks, almost to the letter as far as their progression through the CSLA framework. But this one's just to give you an overview and to give people who want to learn more or learn more about some architecture practices, to give them something small to look at, they can go on. So just understand that the data portal is the mechanism within CSLA that clones that up to the whatever the destination is, a remoting server, WCF server. You just tell the data portal where and what, and it'll do it. and then they talk to a database. Now on your app servers, I'm assuming that your app farm has the exact same setup on each server, which means it includes the data access project, which we'll see in a moment. It's nothing but interfaces and data transfer objects. Those are simply containers for persons, say first name, last name, all that stuff. The data transfer objects, or as I call them, DTOs, they'll contain public string, first name, public string, get and set. No code. They're nothing but dumb containers. And the interfaces define a set of behaviors that the objects which implement them down here in the implementation, in this case we're using SQL 2000 Express, they must at a minimum supply. Now we are going to interface actually with this through the interfaces, but this project right here, the SQL 2000 Express, is what can be thrown away, replaced with MySQL, replaced with some third-party database tool. We want this application to be data neutral, meaning that we don't care where the data comes from. All we care about is that our CSLA business objects are smart enough to know their own rules. Let the DBAs do what they will. And we have behavior guaranteed here. So as long as everything here implements this, we're good to go. Now this library.net and the library.net, the CSLA business objects, server side is the same project. So you have to reference it in both places. And you say, well, wait a minute, Dean, we don't want the client to have our code. Look, you can give them a DLL, and there's no database information in it as far as your connection strings or any of that. Why? Well, let's look at the architecture. Here, the only thing you need to tell your presentation layer is what? Where the data portal is and what kind of data portal it is. All of your interfaces with your objects are going to be through the data portal. Now on your app servers, you're going to have to tell them where. We're going to have to tell them two things. What kind of database is it? Or data store, could be data sets. And where is it? So you've got security of the firewall protecting your data store. Good separation of code. And here we've got IIS hosting our WCF endpoints, which we'll go over. Now you can get the code right here at this link using the login CHI and the password CHI, and that's chosen for obvious reasons. So I urge you to do that, and we'll go over what you need to do with it. You're going to need Visual Studio 2012, and you're going to need SQL Server Express 2012. And it would help to have SQL Management Studio 2012 as well. Okay, so we're going to move on. We're going to get off of this, and we are going to go to the code. Actually, let's go to the database first. Let's go to, I've got a project in here. It's called Project Documents. You can find all of these project documents. Let's go to the database backend, and remember I said we were using SQL Server. So all we've got on the database backend is a really simple database. A person submits status updates that relate to projects, and they're part of some security role. Reason I have this is because the team members that I manage all over the world are required to submit weekly status updates, and Excel's used right now. It doesn't matter what company I work for, whatever, but it's just a team thing. And it's just easier to be able to do it daily really fast, and to me as a manager and my co-managers pull that report, build up the pretty one the managers want with the click of a button. It's all about optimizing time. You're welcome to print this, play with it, use it. You can pull the source code down. You have read-only, you just can't check in code changes. Okay, that covers the database. And like I said, we're not going real in depth here. We're going to go over the person object really, and that's it. Just give you an idea of the architecture and how it works, and hopefully at the end of it that light comes on. So we're going to start here, CSLA, and the CSLA source code can be downloaded from lotka.net. I would say as a constant rule, always include the CSLA source code in any CSLA project I write. And let me tell you why. Suppose you write an application today, and it comes out and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So good, in fact, that it's put in SVN, which I use here, Visual SVN. It's put on the source control server for 3 years and nobody touches it. They just keep using it, using it, using it. You get a new director, and all of a sudden the director's like, man, this thing's wonderful, but I want it to do this. So all of a sudden someone's pulled, they've got to work on it, and CSLA, instead of being on version 4.5, is now on version 5.125 or something. And what do? By including the CSLA in this, you're guaranteed that in the future you've got the CSLA you were using. And some would make the argument, oh, well, you need to take it up to the newest standard. Look, it's all about time and money. Sometimes there's not enough of either. Actually, I would say most of the time there's not enough of either. So get it working, keep your managers happy, and your life will be much easier. So that covers CSLA. Whole source codes here, get it. You have to forgive me, I got a little bit of a bug going around, so I got a frog in my throat. And it's Sunday, and we have a full house, so we got people running around. So if you hear them in the background, it's Sunday. Alright, the next layer up above the CSLA framework is the one I was talking about, being the actual one that's going to define the interfaces and the data transfer objects. That's your data access project. This is going to be on your application server, right? So if we go in here, we'll see that I've organized it into 2 folders, interfaces and data transfer objects. But I want to point out something here on the actually, why am I doing that? That's not the one we want. We're doing person. I want to point out here, see my namespaces? I did not include the folder names as part of the namespace. Both the interface and its counterpart, I call them blank transfer objects, data transfer objects, are in the same namespace. That keeps you from having to remember dot this, dot that. It's just a mess if you don't. Now, if my compiler looks different than yours, I use a product called Dev Express Code Rush, and all of Dev Express's tools are wonderful. So mine may look slightly different than yours. Alright, so let's look at this. The person data transfer object, which is here. If we looked at the database diagram, which we can, we would see that they're identical, except for 2. The is new and is deleted. That's metastate that I like to keep on there. Now I've heard that with 4.5 it's kept on there for you now, but I'm going to leave it in my data transfer objects, that way I know it's there. That just helps us know that the object is new, old, or deleted. And I'll show you where we use that. We use that here in just a little bit. So the only job for this data transfer object is to communicate between the whatever database technology we choose. In this case, this project, SQL 2000 Express, communicate whatever technology we choose, can communicate between this project and its consuming project, which in this case is our CSLA middleware. So that we truly do have a database or data technology we can throw out. And that's where the whole concept for this comes in. So these aren't CSLA, have nothing to do with CSLA, but they are good design. And I can't say enough about good design, especially when you come in early. You want to get it right ASAP. And this gives you the ability, because back-end data stores change. Server people, database people, whatever's cool or whatever's cheap, you're going to see back-end data stores change all the time. So it only makes sense to have a data back-end that you can get rid of and not rewrite all your business rules, which is what CSLA helps us do. So hopefully that makes sense, and you get the understanding that the data transfer objects are representations of the table. So they are, in fact, direct copies of the table minus a couple of meta tags, which is new and is delete. And that would be for any of these. The interfaces, on the other hand, they tell us what we have as far as functionality. What kind of functionality are we going to have, or must we provide in the implementation of the data access layer? Your creates, your updates, your deletes. What is required? So we will implement this interface, obviously. If people thinking ahead, these interfaces are going to be implemented here in our data layer. And this one, right now, the person, you can get them all, and notice the data transfer objects are the objects we're passing around. You can get one if you send it the primary key, and this is actually the function we're going to focus on for, to keep this video short. Or you can update. You say, whoa, wait a minute, where's the insert and deletes? Well, that's why I like to make the person data transfer object smart. As smart as I can by putting those two state tags on it, is new and is delete. Because there's only a few capabilities, right? If it's new and it's deleted, what do? Nothing. Right? It's not in the database, it's new. They deleted it on the client side, so I guess we could set its primary key to -1, which we do. But we don't, there's no reason to hit the database. If it's deleted and it's not new, what do? Well, in this case with people, if you'll remember from the diagram, they have status updates. Well, we don't want to really delete them in their status updates because we might want to run historical reports. So we just have a flag on there called isActive. We will mark that isActive to false. And then we say, okay, well, if it's not deleted and it's new, we insert it. If it's not deleted and it's not new, we update it. And we only need one function to do that. So it just makes it a lot more manageable and a whole lot less code strung out everywhere. And you'll see that in just a second. So having said that, let's look at this class here. This is our DAO manager type. What this is going to be is in your application server layer, you must tell CSLA what kind of database backend am I using. In this case, it's going to be what's the project name and what's the default namespace to find the DAO manager object, which we're going to see here. Where's this object? And in this case, it's in your data access project. So that covers your data access. I'm sorry, your SQL project. That covers the data access project. Its primary job, the data access's primary job, is to provide a framework of functionality, communication, and data holders, if you will, transfer objects, so that we can implement any data backend and be guaranteed through interfaces behaviors, functions, all kinds of good stuff. But it's not CSLA. This is C#. Now, some stuff is in there for CSLA, right? The DAO factory we'll use later, and the over here the DAO manager we'll use later. These are going to be used by CSLA later. That's why they're there. I wouldn't have them there otherwise. Okay, so let's jump into the SQL Express implementation. We have a data file, which is going to be your your SQL 2012 database. Now be careful when you attach this file. I don't like Visual Studio's built-in database manager, so I use SQL Management Studio still, and so I'm going to bring that in here. I use SQL Management Studio right here, and the reason I use it is because it's got the diagrams, and I can do my diagrams. I handwrite all my stored procedures. I know you can generate them. There's opportunities to generate them. To keep my skills sharp, I don't. And now if you're on a project and there's 10,000 stored procedures, they're nothing but repetitive, sure. But for my own personal training projects and everything I do here is going to be hand-coded. You've got your tables. We don't have any views yet. And this, as we make more videos, will evolve as well. Now, one thing you need to know, and something to be really careful of, is when you go up here the first time, when you download the source code from SVN and you want to attach to that database file, when you attach, and you go to add and you select it. I'm not going to do it because I've already done it, but it's going to attach to it, and the project name is going to be something like C colon, with source control slash blah 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 slash something MDF. Change that, just click on it, right click, change the name, and change it to Project Report DB. Believe me, it will save you a ton of headache later. So that's enough about that. Alright, so let's come over here. We're in our SQL implementation project. Let's come over here to person, because that's what we're focusing on. And you'll see I've got a lot more code written, but we're focusing on person for the video, because I know that some people watching it have a whole lot of other things to do. And all it is it is the implementation of the interfaces. That's all this project does. For a given technology, implements the interfaces. Pretty simple. The one I told you we were going to use is this fetch. Now you say, wait a minute, why didn't you call it get? That's the old habit. That's CSLA working. CSLA uses that data portal, and it's got fetch, update, different words it uses in it. And the longer you use it, the more that CSLA becomes part of your object-oriented thinking patterns. And you start using these words, and they just make sense. So you could say get, but remember, if you say get here, you've got to change it over here. I'd use fetch. So get it by primary key, we think. That's what the intent is. And all of you have probably seen this before. Now there's some things in here that's new, I guess. There's some CSLA in here. And let me show you up top. We've got CSLA.data. So let's cover a little bit of CSLA. These using statements, you'd be surprised how many people that I talk to on a daily basis, developers, who don't do this or who haven't seen it. And one of the biggest problems you run into when you're dealing with high volume .NET applications, and like I said, I specialize in middleware, is all these connections, performance issues, and the reason that it's done is because people with .NET got a little bit lazy in garbage collecting and cleaning up their own mess. And .NET does a reasonably good job of doing that for you, but when you do it like this, you ensure that it's going to get cleaned up, because once that using's over with, it's done. So what we do is we use a connection manager, which is part of the CSLA. We tell it it's going to be an SQL connection, so we tell it what kind of connection, and then the manager SQLDB. Well, what that is it says, look, I want a new connection of type SQL connection, and this is the configuration string we're looking for. That's not going to come to play in this project, is it? The Sql Express, because this doesn't have any functionality in it for processing. Now it does all your database stuff, right? But it's going to be included in what? In our WCF project. The actual portal for WCF is where we will define in its web.config this DB. If we come in here to connection string, see that SQLDB? The WCF endpoint must declare what is the database. SQLDB. It's not magic. Connection strings, SQLDB. There it is. Okay, so we do that, and then we create a command, right? And this is your context connection, create command. And then we tell it what the name of store procedure is. We add that, and then we use right here one of my favorite things: the data portal, and then the safe data reader in CSLA. The safe data reader is what Microsoft should have made the data reader. The safe data reader will actually, if you run into type mismatches, won't eat itself. And I don't know why Microsoft hasn't taken this, because the code's out there, and at least tried to implement it or get permission or do something. But if you're not going to use CSLA and you're still going to do double OP with an interchangeable DAO, which you should, or I would highly recommend, use the safe data reader. Just take it out of the CSLA framework. You can get the class, put it in yours, and go. Only thing is, give Rockford Loca Magenic credit for the safe data reader, because it's awesome. And you'll see me use it here where I get ints, and notice the type. What I'm doing is I'm saying, look, if we find this person, then load up this data transfer object with the data from the reader. And notice at the end of it, I mark my flags, and I say, look, it's not new because we found it in the database, and it's not deleted because we found it in the database. Now, where is a caveat in this? There's one caveat that we need to remember. And you're right. It's the isActive flag, right? And so the isDeleted, I'm actually going to change my code here, and I am going to say you know what? I'm going to leave it the way it is, and I'll tell you why later. We're going to leave it the way it is because if we mark it as deleted now and it's not new, it's going to just go re-update this row, and we don't want that to happen. We want to remain at state. You say, well, it's not that big a deal. It's one object. Yeah, but imagine you had 100,000 of them. For performance reasons, we're going to leave it the way it is. Anyway, that's all we do. We go get the person, we load up the data transfer object, we return it to whoever called it, and guess who's going to call this? You're right, the CSLA business objects are going to call this, because I told you that this project, this data access project, which contains interfaces and it contains data transfer objects, functions as an intermediary between your business objects and the back-end data store. That's how you get data neutrality, is you interface it through the data access project. So your library objects don't know anything about your data access.sql 2012. They don't care, nor should they. Alright, so I think I've beat that about to death. So I'm going to close this and not save the changes. Alright, so that covers the Sql Express. It's just CRUD stuff, create, update, and delete. The tests, look, there are 100 books out there over test-driven development, over testing, this, that, every buzzword you can think of. Unfortunately, software engineers, architects, and this live and die by keywords and buzzwords, and it drives me, as a former sailor, soldier, whatever you want to call it, drives me nuts. If you have a function, have a test. If you can't put your head around that function enough to write a logical test, then you don't understand your work order well enough. It's that simple. If you can't write a test, take some extra time, read your use case, and understand the problem. In this case, it's very simple. We're just testing the updates and deletes and all of that. And it's true. Some of these things aren't in Visual Studio because I know they are in CodeRush, but it has its own. It has its own versions of this. It has nothing but a test project type. And these are unit tests. So if you have a function, have a test. I would agree that there are 1% of the functions out there that you can't have a test for. And I'll give up that 1%. Alright, so the whole purpose of the test is to test. That just guarantees that you're not troubleshooting something in the business layer that's not in the business layer. Alright, so the final part of the back end is going to be your host, your IIS host. And this is, it kind of cuts both ways. Number one, for those of us that know WCF, it's thankfully the easiest project in here. Probably next to your data transfer objects. They're about the most boring. But it's also the most frustrating if something goes wrong. Because the IIS host, or if you're using Cassini or whatever you're using, is the most forgiving part of Visual Studio 12. You can have errors in your app.config file, or even forget to reference something in your references, and it'll build just fine, but it won't work. Furthermore, if you're running it under the debug mode or non-debug mode of Visual Studio, the first time you run it, it's going to crash because it doesn't start. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute. But let's look at the IIS host. It is a WCF project type, right? It has a web.config. Now this is my original. I leave the original because once I go to messing around with it, I always want the original back if something goes wrong. The web.config is arguably the most important part of the not arguably. It's equally important to your references, but extremely important on this WCF portal. Because all this WCF portal is, the easiest way to add it is just to right click on IIS host, go to add, and go to new item, and add a class. And I'm going to say new portal. I know I know what some of you are saying. Well, Dean, in the new one there is a WCF type. Well, here's a problem with CSLA. This is all we want. We don't want code behind. We don't want any of that stuff. All we want is this one line, right? So the easiest way to do that is the new portal. Come in here and copy this. And just keep this in your code snippets or somewhere. Come in here and get rid of all this stuff. Right? Save it. Take this and rename it. Go to the end. To SVC. Say yes. There you go. Done. You're finished. Now I'm going to get rid of it because you don't want two portals that define the exact same type. So I'm going to get rid of new portal. But I just wanted to show you how to do that. Okay. That's all that's in here. Now, the references, we got to be really careful. Because you need to reference CSLA. You need to reference your data access. Remember, that's our interfaces and data transfer objects. And you need to reference your SQL 2000 Express objects and your library.net objects. So your server is aware of everything. We'll look at the web.config in a minute. So if you forget any of these, you're going to get an error that says cannot load type something. Or you're going to get an error that says 504 blah 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 function not allowed. Alright. So what I do as a general rule is anytime I finish any edits to anything, I come in here and I right click and I go to browse. And do this before you run it because this actually starts the testing browser. And what you're going to get is this. It's going to load up the service. Now the first time it's going to be slow because it's not running the debug service. It drives me nuts because if you went in here the first time and you had the whole project written, you went to debug, start without debugging, it'd blow up. Because the Windows GUI, you go in there and say 1, hit load, and bang. And the reason is because the service isn't running. Now it is. Now if I hit refresh, it comes up instant. But that first one I paused it for 10 seconds because it took 10 seconds to come up. And this machine has, 8 gig of RAM, so it's not a slouch. It's just slow the first time when it starts at that IIS host. So I'm going to close this and let's look at the web.config because this is where you just pull your hair out. I'm not going to go way into the WCF configuration part of it. But what you do need to know, remember I talked about DAO manager type in the app settings. The DAO manager type comes from here. See that DAO manager? It previews on the left. See that DAO manager, the object DAO manager in our SQL? This is where you have to tell CSLA what kind of backend data store are we using. And in this case, we're using the SQL 2000 Express project. And then tell them where that object is, the DAO manager object. Give the complete path to the DAO manager object as the project has, because we have a reference, if we remember, to that project, the data access project. Give them reference to it, and then what's the default namespace? Make sure your namespaces in your DAO are all the same. That's what I do. Alright, so that covers that. Now the connection strings, right? I said the connection strings were going to be exposed at the server level. Well, that makes sense. We're in the web.config. We need to say where that SQLDB is. And you're like, whoa, Dean, you showed me that. Where was that? Well, the SQLDB came from, let me find an object here. Where's that person? Is it open? There's the test. We don't want that. We want the person DAL. Remember this? When the context manager went out and created our connection, or pooled it, or did whatever it did, there it is. And you've got to have it in here. And then you've got to, these are your service behaviors for your WCF. And you can find all the information you want about that online. I'm not going to get into it right now. Okay, so that's the IIS host project. Now we're getting into just a couple left, and we're finished. The library.net. This is the meat and potatoes. So let's look at what this application does. And if I already did it, hey, it's been 35 minutes. Give me a break. I'm going to load this person. I'm going to click Load Person. And there's the person. All bound out for me. Now, I didn't make the GUI pretty. Remember, I'm a middleware guy. I can do GUIs. But I wanted something. I only worked on this, believe it or not, yesterday. And putting the videos together on Sunday. And then I'll do something else later. So just to help some people understand some of the architecture I've been exposed to. And maybe give some people some ideas, hopefully. Alright, so that's what it does. And this is all using CSLA. So if we go in here to library.net, finally we get to see a CSLA object. Now remember, I said that CSLA objects have to be serializable because the data portal is going to clone them over the wire. These are your properties. I like to break my objects into properties and data portal, and then if I had some custom rules and things, because these objects are smart. They need to know if their fields are required, if you have date times like start date, end date, if you need a custom rule that says, look, the end date has to be after a start date, or you can't put someone in there if the email's already in the database. There's rules that you can set up to do that within the objects, and they're obviously not for this video, they're for a much more advanced video, but they're there and they're not hard to use. You just got to get your mind around the concept. So the properties, they're serializable, but they're also bindable, which means on your GUI you can bind directly to them. Now these are different than you've seen in the past because they're static and they're saying, look, it's an int ID property and you're going to use some lambda here and register the property, which is this. This so it doesn't have to use as much reflection when you bind it, and it helps you manage your properties. The get property does a couple of things. Built in CSLA are authorization. Let's say admins can only look at someone's social. Well, on the SSN, you get property, ID property, and then you'd put a rule in there that says, look, even here you could say comma, or whatever group was able to load that. Now I haven't implemented it here yet, but you could. And if they're not allowed to view it, it doesn't explode. It sends back the default value. Very graceful. The same with load property. Load property, notice it's private because we don't want them setting our primary keys. Load property just puts a property in there. Set property checks the rules. Load property ignores them. Load property. Let's know the difference. The other thing is, you'll notice I included a space called system.componentModel.data annotations. What that is I can go in here and if you remember the old days, when you used to drag objects onto the screen and you got that fancy Windows data grid on the WinForms, it gave you the column names that match the field names in the underlying object, and it just drove me just nuts. And so now as .NET's evolved, and we can now put display names that says, look, it's called isActive, but show this in the grid. Is active with the space, and you'll see that in a minute. In fact, if I go in here, let's just do that. See, is active with the space, role ID. So you can go through here and see a few things. Username. Okay. So that's our properties. I don't need to go over every one of them, but you understand how we do properties. They look a little different. Data portal activities. This is the meat of a CSLA object. Remember, CSLA objects, when you call a data portal, it does what? It clones itself over the wire to the application server and does the work there. Unless you mark it run local, which like here when we create the object. When we create a person, is there anything we need to go back to the database to get? Yes or no? And that determines whether or not you run local. Run local saves you a network trip, which is your slowest, your highest amount of latency. And you'll notice that the methods are static because we're using factories. Now, why? And you see here, Dean, why do you have if Silverlight? Well, the reason I have if Silverlight, remember, if you're using Silverlight, every call to the back end is asynchronous, right? Can't do synchronous calls. So there's some different, you have to provide callbacks and things like that, but I'm not writing this thing for Silverlight yet, so I'm not worrying about it. Now there is some stuff that's provided for some if you want to do it asynchronous. I would never do it on a web page, and on a WPF application I would do it sparingly. Just introduces there's some new weights and some things coming to the framework to help, and believe me, I've done a lot of multi-threaded apps. There's a lot of things coming to help, but right now still, if you have a design that's good enough, you can do a lot of things synchronously and then back-end LOV stuff async. So, alright, so let's say that we're going to get the person. This is a function we're caring about right now. Public static person edit, that's our type. That's this business object, get a person, and we send it the ID. And notice it says return data portal.fetch ID. Now, this is going to clone it over the wire, and then it's going to, the data portal is going to look for the fetch that allows one int as a parameter. And it finds it. And it's going to run this code. Well, remember I said that we were going to use the data access project, and look, we're doing that right here. The DAO factory. Remember I told you this was going to come into play later? It has. And this is where we go, and through the interface we fetch it. And this is the magic, the beauty. We're doing it. And since the SQL 2012, we can chuck it in the garbage, replace it with MySQL or whatever, because we're going to implement those interfaces, and it's just going to execute that code. Now you got to make sure that code's good, or it's going to be bad, as far as the results. But it works. Bypass property checks is a CSLA keyword, and what it does is it says, look, I know we're loading the object, or we're doing something to the object that's going to change the values potentially for a little while to invalid values. So don't throw a rules broken message, and don't refresh, and don't do any of this stuff that causes these flashy screens when you're using. I still see products that come out of the box that the screens flicker, and all that is the binding. So this tells it to just relax. I'm loading the object. I know it's not totally good to go. And again, put it in the using statement. If in doubt and you can do it, put it in the using statement. It'll clean it up for you. And you can look down here and find some more code where I've done transaction stuff with the inserts and deletes. I don't have the GUI for it yet, but it's here. And this will be a fully functional Dev Express pretty app, in a couple of months, because this is I'm going to dedicate 1 or 2 weekends. I'll put one day into it a weekend, and take it on down the road and get it finished, because I'd like to have a complete video training series on CSLA this year. It's on my goals. Okay, so that covers the basics of CSLA, and now I'm going to show you how did I do this. Well, it's a Windows form. It's a Windows form project. I reference CSLA and I reference my business layer. That's it. And then, because I did that, I now have under data sources the person edit. Well, wait a minute, Dean. How'd that happen? library.net, person edit, serializable, public properties. Right? There it is. And I just selected what do I want. And I went zip, drug it over. Created the binding source and the navigator. Don't really need a navigator because there's one, but whatever. I'll leave it there for this little deal. And then so whatever primary key you put in here and you hit load person, it's going to go out and it's going to go to the WCF service. And I'll show you the app.config. And it's going to pull the data back. So let's look at how the data portal knows what to do in our app.config. Two keys you need. What are you doing? Like if you were doing remoting proxy, you'd put remoting proxy there. And you can look in the CSLA documentation for all the proxies. There's a lot of them. I use WCF 99% of the time. It's fast, it's efficient, securable. I mean, you can do custom principals, custom identities. You can encrypt it. I mean, it's just, WCF's a great way to do it. And then you tell it, where is it? That's why I said that URL when you browse to get it. If you go up here to your IIS host and you go down to your WCF portal.service and browse. Yours could be different from mine, so if you get an error, see how it's taking a minute? There it is. You just make sure that this localhost portal service matches. Put the HTTP in there. And if I have a server, I've got a server I'm setting up remote, so there may be a third line in here by the time you see it, and it'll say Dean server. Just remark this one out and unremark the other one, and it will actually point to a remote server, it'll point to mine, if your firewall allows it. If it doesn't, oh well, it'll work from your home if you're working from home. And I'll leave it up from now on. Okay, that basically covers it. Let me show you on the back end what happens when you click this button. All we do is change a cursor. We get a temporary integer. We're going to pull out of that box on the try parse. So then we say, look, this.personEditBindingSource.DataSource. It uses an object serializable, which we know that our library, our CSLA middleware objects are. We say, look, go get the person using that integer. Nothing here, and this is what's so great about it. There's nothing here. Let's imagine that you've got your middleware team right in your library, and you've got your GUI team doing the GUI. There is not anything for them to worry about with WCF, serialization, business rules. Nothing. In fact, the rules engine within CSLA can be hooked to validation components within a visual GUI to show them the error messages, and you can soft glove the message. So hopefully this video has whet your appetite a little bit about CSLA. I can't stress enough how much I encourage you to read that book. It's at lotka.net. And let me bring that up for you here. And I don't get paid for this. I'm not endorsed. I mean, this isn't even the company I work for. And it's his personal. So you go to the ebook series. This is the one I personally own. And get all the ebooks. Buy the whole series. $79. Well spent. And if you want to get it printed, Staples is a whole lot cheaper than Office Depot. Here it is, anyway. Alright, so hopefully this helped. If there's anything I can help you with, send me a message. You can go to Bortell, BORTELL, the number 2, at hotmail.com. And I'll respond to it as soon as I can. Thanks a lot and have a great day.